So why don't you pop in one of the slides? If it takes too long to cue it up, we'll skip it. But maybe if you cue it up and play it just while, or sorry, the video. Sorry, the video. Okay, so to briefly start, I thought I would first just point out, oh, that's great. We'll just let this play for a second. At the end of the talk, I want to come back to a project for a line of houses, of which this is one. Actually, if you could rewind it about, say, 2 minutes, it'd be great. So the first thing I wanted to point out is just that in my talk will understand that there's a kind of a conspiracy, a theoretical conspiracy between theories of capital and theories of ecology. And I think it's very interesting that these two things are merging, and probably with the exception of psychoanalysis, they're the only persistent master narratives we're working with now. So the fact that the master narrative of capitalism and regulation of capital and production is fused with a master narrative of ecology and nature. I think now is the moment these two things are probably coming together, and I think that all of the students sitting in this room and many of the faculty have been working within this paradigm for quite a long time of ecology and capital. So in that sense, I think this conference becomes very interesting, and where I would want to place the discussion today is redefining what the generic is. The generic within an ecological perspective and the generic within a perspective of capital and production. So to get there, what I want to do first is just quickly introduce a new vocabulary that architecture has been working with and talk a little bit about the character of that vocabulary, and that is a vocabulary of deformable, flexible surfaces, the mathematics of which tend to be calculus or differential equations. So if architecture previously was thought of in terms of points, lines, and planes, all of which had fixed coordinates, now we tend to think in terms of curves with varying degrees of continuity. And I won't bother to sketch one because I'll assume that most of the architects in the audience are already familiar with them, but they get called splines. And these splines are hanging curves that dangle between points. So we still work with points, but the shapes that are derived from those points are actually flows. So a 7-degree curve is more continuous than a 3-degree curve. The reason is that the curve is being calculated between 3 points instead of between 7 points. So all of our shapes are differential equations, and they're differential equations calculated to certain sets of points. Now, that means that a change in any element along one of these splines will change the whole shape of the curve, so that fluctuations in points get transmitted across a shape so that you get both continuity and you get variability, and you get it both within the whole and within the variable. So that for me, the new generic would be something which thinks through this issue of continuity and variability in such a way that the generic is no longer the minimum or the pure, but in fact the generic becomes the kind of potential, the mathematical and shape potential of a system in its ability to be whole and in its ability to be differentiated. So now to just make a claim about architecture, and this is maybe more of an aesthetic claim, but I'm really not interested in one or the other bandwidth of that argument. So instead of trying to make architecture into monolithic continuities, where architecture would try to mimic, let's say, these kinds of computer renderings, where you don't see the elements, what you actually see is more the continuity, I think that's maybe not so interesting. I think it's not so interesting for lots of reasons, from structure and engineering to aesthetics, but trying to make architecture mimic a computer rendering isn't where I want this discussion to go. Instead, I would argue that architecture is the assembly and organization of components in space, and that we're shifting from the assembly and organization of those components in modular, standardized systems to rhythmic modulations of elements in space. And that's primarily due to this shift to calculus in terms of our mathematics, and also the controlling geometry that comes along with that is these spline geometries. So just as an example, I thought I would show this church project in Queens that was just completed with two other architects, Mike McInturf and Doug Garofalo. And I'll show you just one technique for these surfaces here. So here, there's one space that I want to just focus on, which is an outdoor entry space. And this set of elements, you know, a few thousand components, were organized with a controlling geometry which was spline-based, meaning that there were curves that captured a kind of a blob shape on the face of the building, and each one of the points that was derived out of those spline curves is set in a rhythm to the next one. Okay, do I control the slides? With this? Sorry, it's been blue. Got it. So in one direction, we wanted this space to seem like it was an enclosed volume. And from another direction, we wanted it to open up with a view to the city. So that as you come into the space, you're reading a rhythm of components such that they overlap and close the space. And when you flip around and look the other direction, you're reading a rhythm of components which is opening and tearing and facing back out to the city. So, and the same technique continues on to the interior of the building, where there's a repetition of elements which are similar because they're derived from the same holistic structure, but locally, every one of those elements is subtly different. Now, what happens when you look across a set of these elements like that, you start to see a rhythm forming. And the rhythm isn't a rhythm of variations against a pure standard or variations against a module, but it's actually an extendable rhythm of curvature, right? So although there are no curved elements in this interior, I mean, there are some slightly warped surfaces, the tearing and faceting is what actually lets you read the rhythm effects. So if this was a single closed volume, it wouldn't have these kinds of qualities. You actually need the elements, and you need the elements put into a relation of calculus. Okay, if you could stop the video. The second thing I wanted to just address quickly is a comment that Winnie Moss made, I guess now a little over a year ago, where he said that this kind of a strategy of rhythm and variation and surface is a neo-Jugendstil, or even an Art Nouveau. And I think maybe not even by coincidence, I was asked to do an exhibition with a painter at the Secession Building in Vienna, which is this secessionist masterpiece, but a kind of Art Nouveau variant. And what the painter Fabian Marcaccio and I tried to do was treat the structure ornamentally, in the sense that it would have the variation one would associate with vegetable form, or the vegetable form of the cabbage dome. So in this rendering, you'll see the cabbage dome, and this is the installation we made, which tries to take that vegetable ornament and pull it down the face of the building and into the gallery space, generating a kind of space which is both structure and ornament because it has variation, and rhythm and structure because it's built out of components. So this is an animation of that dome being pulled and duplicated through the building. It's interesting, we went to a series of contractors with drawings. One kind of drawings was conventional plan drawings with point coordinates. And two of the three contractors said, well, it'll take us 6 months and another 20 plans to figure out how to build this structure. There was a kind of parallel set of drawings we did, which took all of those elements and rotated them flat and didn't really rely on the point coordinate system, but instead tried to describe them in their topology. So these are all of the isoparms or splines from those surfaces, just pulled apart and dissected and rotated flat. So the third contractor, who was a kind of a cowboy in Graz, said, it'll take me about 5 days to cut these out with a computer or milling robot and a computer welder, and then I'll bring a couple of people over and we'll put it together in 2 or 3 days. So instead of taking 6 months, it took a little over a week. So to debug it, my office took those elements and with a smaller laser cutter, computer cut the components and assembled them. And then this is a few installation views of this structure tearing off of the cabbage dome you can see above. And then extending through the gallery space with one of Fabian's paintings. But so the rhythmic effects and the sequential effects of this here, because there are no surfaces at all other than the painted surfaces, really rely on the orchestration of components. And I think that's the first message for whatever this new aesthetics might be. Here I just thought I would show a few more elaborate surface techniques and just talk about an architecture made of flanging deformable surfaces. And it's for a country day school in Cincinnati, Ohio, that I'm doing in collaboration with Mike McInturf also. And it's the same morphology as the church. It's about three of the churches in length, basically, and about the same width. And it's a multi-use space where we built a long undulating roof. And one of the techniques we use is that we take standardized components with a fixed span. Here they're 16-foot spans. And we change the column heights that support those things so that the price and techniques for construction of this undulating roof are identical to if it was a box. So it's a simple existing box construction system treated topologically and treated in terms of undulation, but otherwise it's identical. Then underneath this system, this roof system, hangs a series of buildings. So there's a common study area, a new library, an administration building, a theater, and a dining hall. And all of these spaces had different orientations one to another. So the way we started to orient the spaces is by offsetting and undulating all of the different components of the walls and ceiling. So for instance, in this, actually if you could focus that a little bit. In this library and computer center, there's a book stack area here and a computer carrel area here. And we wanted it to all be in the same space, but we wanted to define the space as 2 zones. So you'll see here we twisted the ceilings to bring light in from the east, and here we twisted it to bring in artificial light from the west, so that in the ceiling you see this flipping of the ceiling plane all within the same space. A similar technique for the auditorium here, where in order to make a balcony, we just took the floor and rolled it into an E shape so that the same surface makes the balcony that makes the floor and ceiling. And that's rotated also in another E profile in this direction. And then in the dining, you can see it's also torn so that as you enter the building here, you get views into the dining hall, but from the west, you get occlusion of the view. So these kinds of techniques of torquing and twisting surfaces and then devolving those surfaces into components is really how the shape is defined and the space is defined. So this is that repetitive roof system. And each one of these buildings that's hung from within it. Okay, so the last thing that I want to show you is something which is more calculus and topology. So, for instance, Nike comes out with 30 or 40 different types of shoes twice a year. The conglomerates now of the auto industry are coming out with models faster and faster. And this project really came out of a conference that I was at that Volvo sponsored, where a Volvo engineer said, you know, our factories are so flexible, every single car we make could be slightly different. The only block is the designers. Our designers can't resolve all the problems of engineering and shaping to keep all of the contradictions out of the design process. But every single car could be a different dimension, a different length, could have different interior layouts. The bottleneck is design. And so I started to look around and notice every field except architecture in a certain way had rethought the generic to approach this problem. So that, say, Ford stopped having factories for each car and instead came up with a factory for 3 or 4 lines of car, so that one robot could be making a body panel for a Ford Mustang on a Monday, and if they needed new body panels for a Ford Taurus, it could be making those on Tuesday. So what they had to do is they had to look at all of their cars and rationalize the variations into a generic envelope. But once they'd set the limits for that envelope, they had a very open and endless set of variations within it. And so the more you can systematize variation within an open system and set those limit conditions, you start to get these endless variations for free, more or less, or at least within the same logic of the system. So, and also I moved to Los Angeles and started to get a lot of inquiries about designing houses, and had never thought about a house, and actually was kind of allergic to the notion of designing a house for a patron client, and decided it would be more interesting to come out with a whole line or a whole strategy to theorize the house. So what I did is I set up a kind of generic envelope, which is a topological surface, and it's controlled initially by 12 handles. And this is really a design technique. It's a modeling tool to allow freedom. It's not an automatic or dynamical system in that sense. But what these 12 handles do is control this spline, and a move in any one handle will change the whole envelope. And I just started running through variations of denting these objects, gastrulating them to produce secondary rooms, and changing the overall body plan of the house. And we came up with just a set of variations that we thought would be useful for single-family homes. Then you can see, I'll just quickly run through some of the three-dimensional implications of those variations. And and when I say we, I mean the office and the computers in the office, came up with around 900 variations that we decided to study. So then we started to take these envelopes and try to connect them with robotic manufacturing processes to find out what the scale limits and shape limits were. So the first thing we did is we started to peel them into fronds and lay those fronds out in a planar way, unfolded, so that we could use cutting machinery to make the panels. So we took that data and put it into a high-pressure water jet and started cutting volumes out of steel and then folding the steel fronds back together to capture the original shape. And this is about 1 meter or so in circumference. Then instead of using only cutting systems, we started to look at router systems or shaping systems. and we started off small, where we would break each one of these volumes into two panels, a top and a bottom panel, and then we would cast into them. And so these are the results of those casts. I think we did around 60 or 70 of these studies, and these are very small. And we then started to increase the scale from models to things which were more like house volumes. So here you can see we explode them into 8 strips, and each one of those 8 is broken into a curved chip, and all of those chips are laid so that 3 of their 4 points are flat, and then we skin across all of them to generate a single landscape. And this is all done algorithmically, so once we do it once, all we have to do is go to our catalog of 900 objects and drop it into a little routine. And this part of the process is automated. So those landscapes end up being milled out of, in this case, wood. And you can see in these wood forms all of the panels needed, so that then we cast into the wood, cut out the individual panels, and then could reassemble them into an envelope. And the process, the robotic process of making the panels started to give us a tectonics and give us a pattern. We increase that now from 1 panel to 6, so the panels get larger, and these are just different variations. And then here are the resulting volumes that come out of those variations. Then we decided to start to tackle, if you could switch it. How am I doing on time? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm about right. Another 3 minutes, I'm done. So then the next issue was to try to develop fenestration and to scale these elements up to house scale. And for fenestration, I didn't want to punch windows in these things. I mean, one of the issues of this is that unlike a modernist house where you have an existence minimum, and if you want to make it bigger or you want to change it, you add elements to it. In every one of these houses, there are 2,048 elements. It's not an important number, except that we were never allowed to go over it or under it. So there are always the same number of elements that mutate to produce each house. So if you want something more, you have to generate it out of the system of components, because the minute you add a component, you screw up the whole generic process. So to put fenestration in, we had to find a way to alter the surface in such a way that we could produce fenestration with respect to the topology. So there were 2 techniques. One was louvering, or offsetting, which is very much like that country day school or the church I showed you. The second technique was shredding, which you see here, which is where you tear the elements and spread areas of the topology to generate these shreds. By the way, I know and love Charles's collection of Chinese rocks, and I look a lot at the patterns of shells. Just so you know, it's neither accidental nor design. That technique of treating the surface was translated into the building components necessary to realize these as a house. These are roof plans. I think in the axonometrics, we took 6 and did case study work on 6 of these variations. But you'll see that the glass system is shredding. We put photovoltaic shading on the south surfaces of all these. If I go back for 1 second, we set up a technique where we could find all of the surfaces which were exposed to south light, so that you'll see that the indentations and undulations in the surface gave us these kind of surprising areas of sunlight that we didn't expect, so that it's almost like moss growing on the north side of a tree. We actually found all of the territories on the surface which would get exposed to light, And it gave us something which was very novel or unpredicted on our part. Also, it tended to highlight the voluptuousness of the shapes. So the tearing of the surfaces combined with the shading elements, it finds the aesthetics of the surface and highlights it and really accentuates, I think, the kind of voluptuousness and highlighting of the form. Then here the houses are broken into their components. They basically generate their own landscape. These are garden pavilions where the objects are dented, they enfold the landscape. These are the only things which get added to the system, actually, which we hadn't really designed them in yet. But so there's the shading, the skin, a structural monocoque frame, and a glass skirt that they rest in. These are each one of those components, the torn surfaces, the photovoltaics, the aluminum structure. These are just the working drawings of all the components. And finally, there's a model at the end of this to give you a sense spatially of what it's like. And these are views now of one of those variations as a case study, sitting in the landscape, which was designed by Jeff Kipnis, actually. Okay, thanks.
I'd just like to start off. In a way, when you mentioned the voluptuousness, it was a good example for me of what I was saying about beauty being, if you use the word beauty, being patterns squared, patterns consciously referring back to patterns which had already been set up. And I wonder, the first question is, would you agree? Would you ever use the word beauty? Probably not. But aesthetic interest is increased by patterns about patterns. And that was an instance of it, a self-conscious instance. The other thing I'd like to ask and connect it is that the aesthetics, if you'll forgive me, are rather like Neil Donare's. In other words, there seems to be a vertebrate repetition along a curved surface. And I wonder if that comes out of some economic, technical condition, or why?
Huh. I mean, the beauty is a word I wouldn't, not use, but I would tend to use, as debased as it is, something like fashionable. Or it suddenly hit me, if you look around at other design fields, there are certain effects that are common to a lot of them. Pleating, voluptuousness, iridescent colors, a lot of things that just most of the design world's dealing with, that I actually wanted to push my work towards more and more. And the house is that line of houses is the extreme version of it. So those characteristics of form, for me, they derive out of a new geometrical language that people are designing with, and a new underlying mathematics of it. And it's also just a cultural sensibility. But yeah, I think that's at least what's fashionable. And I mean, with the house, it's also something I've been teaching. I've taught this project for a while. I keep saying it should look more like an athletic shoe and less like architecture, in the sense that athletic shoes are much more fashionable and beautiful, let's say, than architecture is right now. So, that question would be yes, I would be comfortable using those qualifications. The second thing is the tectonics is something I'm really invested in, like the old definition of tectonics as components organized in space. So yes, it would be not really vertebrate, but a tectonic system organized along a spline surface. And that's more of a predilection as a designer than it is an economic constraint. There are arguments both ways, but when you tear a surface and offset it, you tend to highlight edges and components rather than trying to minimize those offsets in favor of continuity. So mean, to me, there's a spectrum between striation and smoothness, let's say, formally, and it's just where you want to fall within that bandwidth. I like to fall more towards striation or tectonics. Yeah. No, it's the issue. Yeah, okay, the question was that most houses are designed from the point of view of a specific program. And where is the program in this, and was the house designed with that in mind? Is that right? No, it's true. You know, we call these things houses. They're not houses because they are completely unprogrammed. Designing them, I have an intuition about the kinds of architectural effects one needs to design a house. But right now, it's just simply a palette. You know, but they're not a line of houses for a particular climate or a particular culture, particular lifestyle. You know, right now, they're basically like a kind of auto industry model of a generic home. So once there's a specific client and location, we'll start to vary these things based on those parameters. But so far, it's an internally constrained system of construction elements, and the internal constraints haven't built in program yet.
In the house you did, what make of motor car do you think would look most appropriate?
Well, there are 3 companies right now, so no, I don't know. I like Lexus colors.
That I think the kind of functionalist notion of beauty, where beauty is kind of coupled with performance, would still hold for a lot of the new aesthetic regimes we're looking at. And you know, the athletic shoes are one example. There's a kind of high performance, you know, articulation in terms of lightweight, in terms of certain, you know, paddings, and the car industry. You could look at that.
Yeah.
And the question is, how far can we extend those considerations to the kind of the new tectonics and new morphologies? And I think here also, at least as a hypothesis, I would venture that we should not rest with a kind of let's say fetishistic notion of or let's say abstract notions of patterns about patterns, etc., but give substance to this kind of presence, I mean, and historical presence of attraction, repulsion in a kind of functionalist sense. And one more hint at that is that we're still kind of, one aspect of the category of the beautiful is that it is beautiful as appropriateness to certain items, to certain, you know, male beauty is supposedly relevant and attached to males, etc., to certain roles within society. So there is still this aspect that I would just venture as a hypothesis to be maintained.
For the house project, I mean, for me anyway, it's only interesting in multiples. I mean, any one of those is maybe expressionistic when you look at it in that model. But I mean, the most interesting thing is, I don't know if you would call it functionalist, but the kind of rigorous constraint of a system. I think when you put any system under constraint and then fight against the constraint with variation, you end up producing beauty, or something like that. I mean, it's the variation against constraint which is the most interesting. So that's why we always locked in on this fixed number of components, just because we knew it would make, well, yeah, more interesting things. Okay, thanks.
This is the one that works. Okay, there was a time when our standard lecture started claiming that the work was actually the result of a paradigm shift in economics, in social organizations, etc., and that basically our work was a consequence of that paradigm shift. So what I'm going to try to do today is start from an entirely different perspective, which is that the work is not so much, or it is still a shift or a consequence of a paradigm shift, but that it has also other potential readings. And the one that I am going to try to explain today is more in respect of how the work fits within the history of the discipline. So I'm going to try to exercise today a kind of historical reading of our own work and how that work, I'm going to be using specifically the Yokohama project and the development of the project that is taking place right now. How does it relate to a number of techniques or innovations that the generation immediately before us has initiated. And I'm going to be talking specifically about the work of three architects. One is Rem Koolhaas, the other one is Peter Eisenman, and the other one is Frank Gehry. So we're going to start, if we can turn the lights off and have the two first slides. Okay, this wasn't prepared between Charles and I. I'm also going to start with the Guggenheim as what I think is the Guggenheim versus the Yokohama project, and I'm going to try to explain in what way are they different despite perhaps the similarity in the formal effect, let's say. I think that the Guggenheim is the jewel, the maximum expression possibly of a paradigm that I would perhaps categorize as architecture as a kind of visual manipulation of forms, of components, and Yokohama is perhaps trying to make first steps in another paradigm that I would call it generically today the material, understanding architecture not as the techniques to control, to manipulate visual or plastic effects. I remember, for example, Rafael Moneo saying in this same room 2 years ago that architecture is a plastic art. I think that architecture, I cannot disagree more with that definition of architecture. Architecture is not a plastic art. I think architecture has to do for me much more with maybe biology or engineering or a number of other disciplines that have to do with the organization of matter, with the almost the attempt to give life to non-organic matter, to use more well-known terms. This schism, this difference can be illustrated very well by an old category, which is art history category, which is the Kunstwollen versus the Baukunst, the will of art versus the art of building. And I think that the paradigm where we are trying to operate is more in the Baukunst, in the art of building, in the art of organizing and processing matter. I think there are other differences between these two paradigms, despite their formal analogy, which are, for example, that Frank Gehry's operates probably more from images or from models. We are much more interested in the process by which that material organization is produced. The process by which a diagram is constantly processing different kinds of matter, and matter is not only literal matter but also social issues, etc., etc. In some ways, I would like to say that matter, in the sense I'm going to try to use it, is not just what we understand as building materials. Is almost anything that can be processed by a diagram that drives this process of creation. There is another, I think, important difference between the two modes of operating, and I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm saying they are different paradigms, despite their similarities, their formal similarities, and by this I want to, in some ways, dismiss the preeminence that visual or plastic issues have taken in the history of architecture since probably the Renaissance. There is another important difference. One is, which is that Frank is, I think, operating within a paradigm of what we can call expression or self-expression, while we are actually more interested in alienation or suspension of desire as departure point of the project. I like very much what Brian Goodwin said about both about the sensitivity to existing conditions, which means you start processing, or the diagram starts processing the matter that is at hand, and also the idea that these processes are in some way, we can only watch them happen. We cannot really inscribe them with a very strong desire, because then probably we will destroy them. So the project of Yokohama, as I've explained this in this same room several times, started with functional concern, which was to organize the circulation in the building. So we made this diagram that attempted to produce what we call a no-return loop as the diagram of the circulation, and that diagram became a three-dimensional object by simply assigning a transformation between a line and a surface, and a bifurcation of a line to a bifurcation of a surface. So the project starts from this functional constraint, and is actually helped. Here I'm going to refer to Rem, to the work that we had learned with. We had to organize this diagram three-dimensionally, and we resorted to the mechanisms that we knew. These are two images, one from La Villette, the other from Den Haag City Hall, and I think that they are extremely important projects that have been used, or let's say this technique of cutting the space into sections in order to gain functional freedom, or the possibility, or producing the architectural possibility of complex programming, have been used by many people, and in some ways the Yokohama project started within with this technique, or within this paradigm, or I don't know if paradigm, organizational system of space that is created to provide maximum flexibility. The same way that, for example, the work that we were seeing before, the work of Frank Gehry, is perhaps more interested in exploring freedoms in form. So freedoms in program, freedoms in form have different associated techniques that we obviously have learned from and are part of our lineage. So these are the sections that we produce. We gave a resolution of 15 meters sections through the space of the building, and that is how we constructed the topography of the project. Now there were some interesting things that were only latent in the competition drawings. These were the competition, the plan of the parking in the competition, which is that the conditions of foundation were asymmetrical. So the building had to have two symmetrical boarding decks, but the building couldn't land on one side closer than 21 meters from the edge of the pier, while in the other side couldn't land within 29.5 meters or something like that. And that is what started to emerge in these deviations of the ramps that made the system. Here you can see the foundation and how on this side is longer, and yet here we are still keeping the symmetry to a large extent, the symmetry of the organization in respect to itself, and how that organization is not yet what maybe we can say so sensitive to initial conditions. The project had also another material approach, which was that this structure, this folding structure that was allocating or hosting the program, had this type of construction that was in some way an attempt to make it trans-scalar, self-similar. The same way that the folds allocate program, the structure had to be also made out of the same technique, which was also a technique that in this case were more sensitive to initial conditions, more contextual, in the sense that was referring to origami techniques, and in the sense that was referring to shipbuilding industries. So this was what we set out to do in the competition, and what sets up the diagrams for the growth of this project. Now, the project went through a first stage that was called Basic Design Stage 1, and in that stage the most crucial problem to solve was to actually produce more information about how this surface, this folding surface, was going to be determined, as opposed to what Frank will do, which is to explore formal freedom. We are actually very interested in formal determination as a way of operating. So there is another important difference, and this was simply the first attempt to increase the level of information in the project to prepare it for construction. The way we did it was to increase the resolution from 15 meters between sections to 5 meters between sections. And we use these lines that, sorry about the slides, but I got them today and they are full of shadows, but I hope they can be seen. We use these lines that we call control lines, that were basically curves that were mediating between the position of the ramps between sections, introducing in between a number of other sections, and therefore determining out of the first setting out of the position of the ramps on the folds along this grid, this parallel grid, the position of the new sections, so that we can increase the level of information. And something very interesting happened, which is what you can see here, which is that once we started increasing the resolution of the system, another series of grids, much more truly based in the functional or circulatory organization of the building, started to emerge. These were the sections. Here you can see how we were still not very sensitive in terms of starting to take into account the asymmetrical conditions. I mean, we were taking them into account to some degree, but later on they became very important in the development of the process. Also because of the pressure of the car park that moved up in that phase to the level of the pier. These are kind of bad moment, mistake in the process, where the engineer, perhaps inspired by this parallel grid that in which we had started the project, started proposing this type of gridded space frame systems that were almost a kind of direct translation of the diagrams of that calculate the structure. So here I would like to, maybe this slide I should have shown it before. It's 2 slides from Peter Eisenman, who I think is also very present and is somebody who I think we can have an interesting debate in terms of techniques, disciplinary techniques. I think the most important thing that we've learned from him is his commitment to the grid, and I think that the grid is extremely an extremely interesting technique or concern, because the grid is in some ways the way, when we look at architecture from this materialist perspective, the grid is almost the stuff that produces the fabric of the matter, the fabric of the space. I think that probably the main difference between what Eisenman has been doing and the way we are approaching this construction of the grid and the development of the grid is the fact that he constructs the grid somewhere outside the project. That means the project doesn't generate the grid intrinsically or as a result of analyzing local conditions so much. I mean, I think there is also a lot of that, especially in the latest work, starting to appear, because obviously all these lineage that we are referring to is also evolving in the use of disciplinary techniques. This is a clear step in this sense. But I think it's interesting to see this drawing in respect to the other drawing, how this drawing also starts, or Eisenman starts always with a kind of 3-dimensional grid, while we start with a b-dimensional grid, and simply by the increase of the resolution, that grid becomes starts to achieve coherence in the other direction, in the longitudinal direction of the project. This is when the next design stage, second stage in basic design, we became very aware of the importance of these local conditions of foundation. Here you can see a section of the pier, and it happens that this is an existing pier that they couldn't get rid of when they expanded the pier, and that's the reason. So in some ways, also we are not inventing the project. We are simply actualizing some of the potentials that were already present on the site. The importance of context in the construction of these grids, or of these fabrics of space, is extraordinary. So we are in some ways inheriting a history of the space in this asymmetric condition. We are being sensitive to the context, and that happens when we have to introduce in the process real design conditions of the basement that is grounded on these two tie beams that link up all the piling heads where the building is supported. So by this moment we had already mastered this idea of the control lines. The control lines, from being simply a mediation between the sections, had become entities in themselves, and they are linking. So this is in some ways what determines the geometry. Now is no longer the parallel grid that we had started with, but that parallel grid had become the definition of these segments, of these radiuses and curves that are linking functional conditions and conditions of foundation of the project. This is the sections that resulted out of this further increase in the resolution of the system. Now we are looking at a resolution of 3.6 meters in between sections. 3.6, actually this is 3.6, but in this phase we reach 1.8 meter of resolution in the sections. And another very important thing happened. which is that we made a new proposal, not a new proposal, but some kind of derivative proposal for that origami folded structure that the project had started with. We divided that structure into two systems. One is the one that is formed by longitudinal, or not exactly longitudinal, but the bridges that are following these control lines now embodied into large-scale folds that have the size of bridges. Some of them have 70 meters span, and another system of folds that spans between them and cantilevers out from them that makes basically the fabric of the slabs, of the floors of the building. This is the way they are thought out. These are the sections of these large-scale folds, and between them there are these diamond shapes that are bridging between them, these smaller scale folds. What isn't, I mean, you can see here, this is a drawing of the engineer, is that we are still relying very much for the organization of the secondary structure on a parallel grid, on that parallel grid that we had inherited from our OMA experience. This is how the project looked at this time. You can see the beams and the fabric of folds, kind of very differentiating folds in between. This is a model of how this new ceiling will look like, and a perspective. And these are some of the details that we were considering. As you can see, there is another very important moment in terms of the progressive complexity of the material of the project. We started, or we replaced this idea of folding by, or we didn't replace, but basically we solved it technically by the introduction of a hinge. So basically the structure has become a series of folds of this shape that are hinged in the corner with a pipe that also carries other sprinklers and lighting, etc., etc. And these folds have then internal stiffeners to make them stable. This is another proposal that we are considering now, in which the idea of folding proliferates, and rather than having stiffeners, we form thinner plates. We are trying to reduce the thickness of the steel to the maximum in order to save costs. The previous option requires plates of 6 millimeters, this one of 3.2 millimeters, but we don't know yet whether it is feasible technically, because also it's more expensive to produce, because you have to make special presses, etc., etc. And it's also very interesting because the depth of the fold varies along the truss depending on the stresses that the fold is taking. This is also another detail of prototypes of this hinge that now has made the fold. And basically what is interesting, or the reason why we turn into a hinge rather than simply a joint of plates, is because that fold changes angle all the time because of the change in depth, and therefore we had to develop a universal joint to fix these plates that now form the structure. These are other tests, other mock-ups of, this is actually another project that was exploring a similar concept that we developed with Hanif Kara, which was also a system that uses always three components, three precast concrete columns that are joined by a system that allows them to produce different heights, allows one system to absorb differences. So this way of approaching the structure, I think, is fundamentally different from this one. This is a photograph of the construction of the Guggenheim. And you can see the chaos, that this kind of going from the form, from the visual into the construction occurs in a way, and despite the formal similarities, our work starts here and tries to produce this as a kind of ordered system that is able to produce these girders and then the plates in between, and we simply see the form as the outcome of this process. This is what is produced by this process, and here there is the last thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of this development of the process. At this point we go into the detail of designing the girders, and we realize that because the girders are warped, when we cut them on a parallel grid, then we get always different pieces. So we start using this other system in which now we are rolling always profiles, steel profiles that have always the same shape along those control lines that now have become really the grid of the project, to produce the girders that reach sometimes enormous complexity but have an enormous amount of regularity despite of that. So here we move finally from that parallel grid system to a new grid system, to a system that is no longer gridded but is vectorial, in which every one of the points is related to another point. These are some of the tests of these grids. This is the parallel grid. These are the new grids that we are producing. This is how Frank Gehry starts a project. This is how we do sketches for a project, and these are computer. This is also quite interesting in respect to what Greg was saying. The grid of the project in this case is produced by a program that maximizes symmetry in the folds in reaction to these varying curves that make the structure. I think that maybe I can stop here. Thank you very much. I was escaping. No questions. Michael. This is the mic.
Just a quick question regarding processes. In some sense, it's kind of surprising that there's one big similarity between the Frank Gehry project and maybe your project, in which the design process basically stops at the time, or let's say the process of investigation stops at the time when the project is handed over to the client. One would then think that I remember one thing that you said in the previous lecture about continuously building information into the project, but then maybe you're also now talking about continuously deducting information from a project, and that begins to talk about the lifespan that is much longer than the one determined by fulfilling the contract and handing the project over, which would then have to do with how is this project occupied maybe in a different way from the Guggenheim Museum, I would think, because you release this product into some kind of environment, and that's when we're really talking about the performance of running shoes, to take Greg's kind of analogy. And I would just like to know, how do you see that? I mean, why does the discussion of process have to end basically at the moment that is determined by the contract only?
At the moment where there is a drawing by the contractor. By the contractor.
By the contract only. The process discussed.
Yes.
The processes discussed basically stop, their lifespan stops at the end that the project is handed over, basically at the end of the contract, when the project is handed over. But then that is actually the moment when it's actually released into some kind of environment.
No, I'm sure that the project, once it is released, as you say, in some kind of environment, also establishes new relationships that with the local social context and with the economic and social context, etc., etc. But I think in some ways, these type of things are. I'm not sure. Maybe you can incorporate them within the materiality of architecture, but I haven't gone that far. But I agree. The project will keep producing or processing matters in the future. Will decay. Will be transformed. Will suffer modifications. But in some ways. I don't know, the contract, maybe the contract that I get doesn't pay me to do that.
I just would like to add one small thing to it. That would actually collapse the action back into some kind of plastic art, because then it's only about the articulation of the project and no longer about the difference that is facilitated by the project in terms of its performance within an environment.
Plastic, but I wouldn't say necessarily into a plastic art. I would say into a building art, into a Baukunst. And I think there is a difference. There is a difference between one and the other.
But you can't draw an absolute distinction. I mean, because especially over materiality with Gary, if you actually know how he works and you follow Bilbao and you talk to the engineers who spent a lot of time with him, working on it, it was very material oriented. And I would only point out that the materiality, I mean, the word material, when I said that the modern paradigm was based on materialism, it seems to me a fundamental insight of the sciences of complexity is the material is much more lively and self-organizing than the modernist thought. In other words, Newtonian material was dead, inert stuff. Now we know that all geologic structures are moving, are very dynamic, and we get an architecture from that. And I think Gary knows that, Eisenman knows that. So there's not the absolute, in a sense, you used a 19th century distinction to draw between yourself and Gary, and in a sense, that's to become 19th century yourself.
Maybe. No, I mean, I think that in some ways to try to keep being new all the time and inventing new paradigms is impossible. In some ways, I mean, the more lately I'm fascinated, for example, by how people produce techno music. Because they don't pretend to invent things from scratch. They process material. They process their history, their sonic history. They mix sounds or rhythms of a certain age to produce something that I don't know if it is new or is not new. They are simply processing material. And I would like to go back also to this idea of play as something that I think it's very important that these kind of processes are almost taken in some way with the distance of a game, of a very rigorous game, of a very serious game, that you watch. That you watch how the engineers operate, how the contractors operate, how the client operates, and how all these things are coming together into a new material that bounds all of them together. That is what I think is for me the role of the architect within this new paradigm. And there is a place for history, for going back to previous models there also, because sometimes they become useful. So why not use them?
I just want to expand slightly on those questions and say, is it realistic to suppose that architecture could be like a tree, in the sense that it's constantly responding to conditions, it's changing the structure, the stresses, the buttresses, and so on and so forth, as conditions change. And this would involve obviously the users in the continuous redesign of the building. I don't know if that's even a practical option. I mean, given that your contract will go on for the life of
Yeah.
the use of the building, would that be something you would want to
I
include?
mean, I didn't have time to go into the second. I had some more slides, and I wanted to show you this little Japanese toy that I didn't have time to show you, because part of the other experiments that we are doing now about the project are about things that move. There was also in the competition some ideas about different orders, seasonal orders becoming part of the life of the building. Now we are starting how these orders become tectonic, and what we can draw or what are the tectonic potentials or movable or changeable topographies. And this is a small Japanese toy that actually we are planning to use to make screens and canopies. That is fascinating. So we are not forgetting about these other things in the building. It's just that I didn't have time to explain them, or perhaps I don't have them so clear yet diagrammatically.
We will now break for half an hour. We'll get back. You all seem so kind of comfortable that to try and redefine these positions. At 5 o'clock, exactly, please. Start, please. We don't want everyone to burn out. In a forthcoming AA publication called the Terminal Line, which is focusing on the work of the young American architect Preston Scott Cohen, whose work has also been shown here at the AA a couple of years ago. Michael Hayes, the founding editor of Assemblage, writes, "Lately one hasn't heard much of arguments for the autonomy of architecture, for the once fiercely defended specificity of architecture's techniques, experiences, and ability to resist encroachments from technology and instrumentality, from other disciplines, and from the all-leveling, homogenizing force of popular culture. Recent design theories of various stripes have tended instead to take an affirmative position with regard to their cultural sponsors, seemingly accepting a certain determination of architecture by new media technologies and demands for consumption against which it is assumed architecture can gain no purchase. As it feels increasing pressure from other forms of image making that challenge its collective communicative symbolic function, architecture seems to have reacted by trying to become just those things. A multimedia fusion of graphic devices collected on an animated alloyed surface of texture and pattern that might just as well be found on an Audi TT or an iMac as stretched across a building. No shift of disciplinary gears is required, but to place Scott Cohen's recent work both in and against much of contemporary discussion, it is to a discourse of autonomy, renewed and revised to be sure that one must return." Now, Michael Hayes didn't know that there was going to be the discussion of the Nike shoes and other such topics when he was writing this piece. But I think more about Scott Cohen later. I think it's very clear that the person that has really done a great deal of significant writing on this topic of the autonomy of architecture, and he has been mentioned already quite a few times, is Peter Eisenman. Peter Eisenman in the 70s and 80s wrote a great number of articles on the whole issue of representation. And I think what I would like to spend my few minutes
doing is, in a sense, a kind of response or a partial challenge, at least, to some of the questions that Charles raised at the beginning, specifically in relation to how things appear to be the way they do. And in a way, I think already in Alejandro's presentation, this relationship between thought and object is something that has come up. And the short version of my presentation is that, in a sense, instead of seeing the gap between thought and representation collapse to become one, so that thought is object or thought is representation, it would be maybe also important for us to pause a little bit and focus on the question of this misfit between thought and object, how they don't always collapse. And this question of the misfit, I think, is significant in terms of what are the situations that produce the disjunction between thought and object. So when Eisenman was writing, one of the figures that I think in terms of the issue of representation was very critical for him was Palladio. And he was discussing this relationship between perspective and architecture. And the issue of the relationship between perspective and architecture, as opposed to perspective and painting, where you have in two-dimensional surface the creation of a three-dimensional condition. In architecture, you have something where you're going from, in a sense, three-dimensional situation to a two-dimensional condition. So you have this collapsing of the three-dimensional, moving towards more and more towards the idea of the surface, towards the idea of architecture itself becoming a kind of drawing or a system of representation. So when Eisenman was dealing with this issue, he referred to the work of Argonne on Palladio. And Argonne says that for Palladio, the image becomes a sign, and the sign is not so much a representation of something else as it is a code for its own internal system. And therefore, for Palladio was concerned not so much with the representation of natural conditions of building, but more with this altered condition of the object produced by the concept of perspective. So we can say that as opposed to the kind of Corinthian columns, for example, that Charles was showing, where architecture tries to imitate nature, Eisenman, following the path of Palladio, argues that, in a sense, architecture imitates architecture, and the juxtaposition of perspective and architecture creates then this situation where the representation, architecture is represented by itself. Thus, perspective introduced into the built object both a connection to and a distinction between architecture and the image of architecture. And Eisenman then went on to develop a whole series of houses that you are very familiar with, from 1 to 11. This is house 3, where this relationship or the reference of architecture to itself was the key thing. But somehow, in a way, despite this issue of the non-representational condition of architecture, the reference of architecture to itself, there comes a moment in the projects where this referentiality to things outside of architecture also become part of the architecture, as in the case of, in the Japanese projects, dealing with, for example, the question of fault and fallibility, or the idea of weakness, where the facade itself becomes literally, in a sense, a representation of that condition of weakness. Now, when Eisenman was discussing the development of his houses from house 1 to 11, when he discussed this idea of the dislocation that was involved between, for example, model and building, and the relationship between the subject and the work, he used these projects to say that the series of houses really, in a sense, represented a condition of doubt, because somehow the collapse of the model onto the building was also a representation of the disclosure of the subject that is in doubt through the work of through the model and through the building. And finally, when he refers to this idea of doubt, he's in a sense also referring to the work of Merleau-Ponty, in his work on Cézanne's doubt, where Merleau-Ponty is discussing how Cézanne was doing, for example, 150 versions of a particular sketch or a particular drawing, and the idea of reworking became something which was a very significant part of this mode of presentation. And I think the best version of the projects that I think have been presented this afternoon address this idea of how you are reworking something. It is not really the image, but it is the idea of the reworking of the work itself that becomes the important part. I think this was touched on the multiplicity of the projects in Greg's work, and I think in terms of the Yokohama project also, in terms of the sequence of the development of the project itself. But I think in the case of what Peter Eisenman was saying, I think ultimately the work refers to the image of the work. It is the image that becomes the primary thing. But what I would like to emphasize is that in Cézanne's, in a sense, it refers to the tradition of painting itself, and it's the painting, the work again, which is the significant thing. So, as opposed to the kind of doubt of the subject that Eisenman refers to, during this period of the development of perspective, I think there was a different kind of doubt that was also being worked on, which was the concept of anamorphosis and anamorphic painting. And these are paintings where they involve a kind of distortion of the perspective, and you can only then see the perspective correctly from one particular point of view. In this particular case, you see 4 figures. They are overlapped on a landscape, and they're the figures of Charles V, Ferdinand I, Pope III, and so on and so forth. But what becomes key is how then the allegory of these characters is juxtaposed with the narrative of the events that are happening also during this particular period. What I think from a representational point of view is intriguing is the way that the portrait and landscape are actually overlapped. So you don't only get the object and landscape, but now you have in a sense a certain kind of juxtaposition of the two together, and that is the correct view of the perspective itself. And there are many other examples of this. So what happens in this work is that the point of view, the idea of the oblique point of view, the oblique angle, becomes an important part of the project. So the relationship between the observer and the work itself is already something which is part of the work. In other words, it is not the work that embodies it, but it's that relationality between the spectator and the work. And here is another case in the Trinità de' Monti in Rome, where you have again this kind of landscape in the corridor and the corrected. And there are many, many examples of this which were developed by the work of this monk, Niceron, who really showed the actual principles of how anamorphosis occurred. And there are, of course, many then precise ways of how to construct anamorphic conditions. And I think the toy that Alejandro had is in a sense a kind of example of this idea of how the condition of deformation is part of something which is seen to be corrected and so on. Now, the thing that happens also through this process of anamorphosis is that the construction of the anamorphic drawing actually constructs its own object, in a sense, which is now independent of that relationship. In other words, this is to do with the concept of the projection as a system of construction, as are then these later developments of landscapes, which are anamorphic landscapes, where on the one hand it's this kind of landscape, and then you begin to see, for example, that it's also the profile. So it's the reverse of what we had before, where the face was overlapped with the landscape. Here, now the face is in the landscape in a way. Now, what in short, I'd like to suggest as an alternative to the idea of the doubt that is in the image and the kind of projections that were developed in the 70s and 80s, which resulted in the object itself through representation becoming the deformed object. In the series of studies that Robin Evans made, for example, of the question of stereotomy, looking at the work of Philibert Delorme and others, this concept of the role of projection is something that is mediated through the material of building itself. In other words, it isn't the image that is being deformed, but it is the relationship between the projection and the system of construction that is part of the idea of deformation. And there is a beautiful example of this in Année, where there is a whole pavement, and then there is a dome, which unfortunately I don't have the real photograph of, but there has been this idea or this understanding that the floor and the ceiling are the same. And Evans goes on to demonstrate how, in fact, there is a fundamental difference between the floor and the ceiling, where the projections, in a sense, allow this whole kinds of total curvatures to occur in the dome. And I just point this out because I think the thing that is the thing that's very intriguing in the way that Evans works is this idea that the work itself contains a kind of fiction or contains a kind of lie. It is not trying to be affirmative of what it is itself. There is this gap between how it appears and how it's constructed. And there are many other examples of this, such as the Santa Sidoni and so on and so forth, where you have this direct relationship between projection and the way things are constructed. And I think there is a continuity of this kind of tradition in various ways that we can see at Ronchamp, for example, where the wall, the west wall, is in many respects a kind of anamorphic wall in terms of the way that it works with light, in terms of the shifting that it constructs in space, and of course the whole connection or relationship between the walls and the ceiling. Maybe we can go on. Or the way that the thickness of the wall constructs very particular conditions of light on the interior, but also the views that are constructed to the outside. Or in a different way, where we think about the relationship between structure and structure as space in the work of the Uruguayan engineer Elidio Dieste with his structural brickwork, which is, in a sense, also spatializing this system of deformation or this system of construction. And I think, obviously, I'm sure many of you are familiar with these cases. But the point, I think, is clear that there is this connection between the drawing, the projection, and in fact the way in which these deformations are reconstructed through the act of building, through the way things are manufactured. And here, for example, is the very beautiful kind of department store that he did, where these kind of bulges create particular kind of spatial conditions on the inside. And there could be many other examples of this idea of the introduction of the oblique. I think these are very modest, in a sense, if you like. These are very modest kind of gestures in the context of the kind of advances that are being made now with, or let's say the researches that are being made now. But for example, in the work of Koderk, you see that these minor kind of undulations, the shifts that create the various relationships to the city, to Barceloneta, or in the project of Baker House by Alvar Aalto, where Aalto speaks very specifically of the way in which the curving of the building itself creates a condition of elongation in relation to the street, so that you don't end up with a flat building where it would have an immediate frontal relationship, but somehow it is a kind of delayed mechanism in terms of the building. And for me, this is in a sense not dissimilar to what Greg was discussing in terms of the Presbyterian Church, where at that moment when you discuss the relationship of the building, in a sense, as an enclosure, and the relationship of the building as an opening, at that moment you discuss a certain kind of relationality, spatial relationality, that is achieved in terms of the construction of the project. Or there is Cristina Iglesias working with Paul Robrecht in the conversion of this warehouse project, where these skylights construct new, if you like, anamorphic light situations, deformed conditions in terms of the way that they work with the light and with the inside. And just very quickly then returning to Scott Cohen, where in the Taurus house there is obviously a following of the kind of work that was done with Peter, but the circle that drags around the surface of the project projects now a physical solid space and really affects the surfaces and the roof condition of the project for this house that he has designed. But in a sense, what I would say is that this project, despite these kinds of transformations of the surface, still remains in many ways within the formal condition of transformation. And it is debatable the degree to which at this stage, for example, the material or the condition of construction in relation to this idea of anamorphosis is affecting the project itself. There are other examples like this house in the Ribble Valley by Homa and Sima Farjadi, where the relationship to the landscape is not, in a sense, that of a visual condition, but that of a geological situation where there is a kind of fiction of a new form of geology that is constructed with these retaining walls that then continue and really infiltrate the house itself, so that doubling, if you like, of the portrait and the landscape, or of the building and the landscape, are the situations that have a condition of reciprocity and then construct a variety of sectional situations. One of the things with being a timekeeper is that when it comes to yourself running out of time, you feel it much worse. But anyway, I will just go very quickly through these just to give you a kind of quick understanding of how this landscape, for example, begins to infiltrate the project, or the way the landscape comes in here or is blocked in terms of parts of the wall being taken away. So that these situations of the geology and deformations are not really things that are to do with the deformation of the building, but this deformation is corrected through one's experience of the project itself. So there's a shift from the idea of architecture as image to one where the building or the construction itself constructs its own spatiality, in a sense. And I think that since we have seen also a number of projects where there is a direct correlation between the deformations of form and systems of manufacture, I thought that I also show you one or two where the forming is regular, but nevertheless I think there is a condition of anamorphosis that is taking place of sorts. This is a project that is just finished by Miley and Peter in Biel in Switzerland, and it's a school for wood engineering. And what is important about this project is that a product like wood, which has also its own kind of if you like, perspectival condition, it has its own image in terms of what is possible to build with wood, is in a sense denied in the context of this building, where they are building a 4-story structure, and they have to address the whole idea of how they push the limits of this material so that it actually constructs a different set of visualities than that which is normally associated with wood construction, for example. So what I want to suggest as an alternative, it's not only that there are new materials and that there is a kind of visibility or representation of new materials. There is also the possibility now, with different systems of machine production and so on, for us to really rethink the conventions of traditional materials in a way. And I think some of these projects, like this of Miley and Peter, are doing that, where they have really created a lot of ingenious situations in terms of, for example, the span or the free floor area, or in terms of the construction of the facade outside, and so on and so forth, which will take too long to go into. And finally, there is a project of your concept, where this is a stone bridge, which is just outside of Chur, again in Switzerland, where the idea of the heaviness of the stone is really juxtaposed with the lightness of the pedestrian bridge. And using, for example, shock absorber technology, you create a situation where the architecture itself is made of something which has a condition of unexpected quality about it. And so, in my opinion, this is also a different kind of doubt, because it's really an architecture which is an architecture of wonder. It is one that makes you, in a sense, surprised, and you in some ways want to find out how this condition of reversibility is really achieved in terms of something which is a very modest kind of project. So with that, I think I've gone over my 26 minutes. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Any questions? Any? No?
I think it's a bad time, but saying that last one, xenomorphic, is rather stretching a point.
I think it's, yes, but I think this idea of the way in which the word material has been mentioned, I think the way in which the material, you raised this thing in relation to modernism. And what I want to say is that there is also a very different version of this concept of material, which in some ways, through the condition of its limits in some way, allows the possibility of the other side of the project, the other, to be something that comes into it. So in fact, it is not something which is immediately revealed, but it has to be figured out in terms of how the thing is made. Okay. And that kind of figuring is also a form of anamorphosis, because it's to do with the idea of masking and how the thing is hidden, and it's a kind of revealed at a later stage. But is there somebody? Chris? Sorry. Sorry? I can't hear you. Do we have a microphone that we can?
One of the things that's implicit in their lecture is also a matter of practice or work, right?
Yes.
Both has something to do with the identity of the architect, right?
Say that again, now we can see it.
Has something to do with switch on.
If the light is on, it's on.
Yep. It also has something to do with the architect's mode of working, and sorry, I'm getting lost.
Can you speak to it? See if it works.
Try.
Joel? No, okay, just sorry.
Was the mode of working, or the identity of the architect as part of the practice, right? Which was also sort of implicit in a little bit of Alejandro's presentation, right? The engagement of the architect with a certain process,
Right.
Which also seems to shift, there's also an implicit sort of relationship that sort of replay Meisman's work, which means the outburst, the image of the architect is outbursty, right? And the lesson is and I was wondering if you'd want to engage with issues of representation as sort of a mode of practice and maybe make that more explicit. It's something I think is very strong in the work, right? The scale of the work, whether it's the modesty of the work, the heroic architect or the heroic architecture. I was wondering if there's something about that you bring out that's been absent in the conversation as well, but it is implicit.
I don't know if I'll be able to say all of that, because it's it's complicated. But Chris is asking about the role of the architect and the relationship of the mode of working to the method of representation, and that this is something that's been, in a sense, implicit, and if there was a way to make this thing more explicit, no?
Well, I mean, because it has been there's been a reference to it in a couple of presentations.
Yes.
It sort of runs throughout the world.
Yes.
But it remains sort of buried somehow below sort of representation, right? As something sort of somehow separate.
No, because I think that when I use the word representation, all these projects, ultimately, they on one level, they deny representation, but they become very clearly representational. So whereas the emphasis in terms of this earlier work, or some of the work, or maybe in terms of our conversations, for example, in terms of looking for the representation of things that are of the contemporary, of current practice, there might be a tendency to try and, in a sense, focus on this idea of the work representing something outside itself. I am suggesting that these particular, or there are certain practices where the concept of representation is still very much part of it. It is not that it's separated, but that the methods that are utilized are methods that are still within certain conventions of practice. That is why I mentioned the thing about autonomy at the beginning. It is not so much that I feel that the autonomy should be seen as a form of essentialism, but that there is also another version of autonomy which has to do with the link between representation, for example, and building, where in the work of people like Miley, they also construct through the project very particular kinds of representations, and it is the mode of working, as you're saying, the mode of practice itself that constructs that visuality. So I think that I don't know whether that's still too implicit, but it's something where the image doesn't come, in a sense, before the project. It's the entanglement of the two together in some way. But maybe this will come out more in the conversation and later. Anybody else? Patrick?
Yeah, I just want to pick you up on the...
Shall we wait for the microphone?
Use the opportunity to pick you up and... Does it work?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah, it does.
On the whole notion of architecture's autonomy as a discipline, because that's very much, I think, a phase in the 90s where there is a kind of moment of reassertion of autonomy to a certain extent, and these are, and I try to rationalize that, not just reject it, as it were, because these are moments of high density of experimentation, where the kind of immediate and instant quest for, let's say, redemption in terms of what is the contribution of these experiments to a kind of socioeconomic progress, which I think in the end should be posed, has to be kind of bracketed and left out in order to let it proliferate. And I think that there's a kind of partial rationality of a division of labor where people like Eisenman, a career like this, makes a lot of sense by bracketing out, literally and polemically, all concerns of functionality, responsibility, etc., and pushes formal repertoire, spatial repertoires, a language and a discourse. And we are still, to a certain extent, the early 90s have been doing the same with picking up the whole electronic media, etc. And in this sense, these are parallel developments to, let's say, the abstract art and the visual arts, where this has become a kind of moment within an overall progress. But I think there seems to be now a moment where a lot of these tests are started to be injected back into a kind of social process, like Michael's question hints to that, and they occur at a scale where they can no longer be just seen as just another model, just another kind of drawing, like a villa for some kind out there in LA somewhere could be seen. These are just manifesto projects or iterations. So now I think there's a moment of reckoning and taking charge of going beyond of that, let's say, temporary realm of autonomy. I clearly see that to be a necessity.
I don't agree that the idea, I am not suggesting the idea of total autonomy or such thing, but I think that there is a lot to be said for the way in which you explore the limits of a certain discipline or the limits of a certain kind of practice. So when, for example, someone discusses the relationality of a window to a particular condition, it is done not just simply in terms of the image of the window, but in terms of the way in which that particular window constructs particular forms of relationality. And I think in that sense, we are going to see, for example, I'm sure with the work of Ben or others, where people are really thinking very specifically, not just in terms of autonomy as a kind of internalized mechanism, but how through the investigation of certain conditions of a discipline, you transform precisely the functionality or the performativity of that particular discipline. And it is in the case of some of the recent projects, I think that there is a shift where it is not the image of autonomy, but it is actually those processes that are engaging the concept of performativity. So if somebody, for example, deals with this delay mechanism or the Mobius or whatever, it also changes the relationality of certain conditions of inhabitation, which is itself, I think, ultimately engaging with some of the issues that you are raising. But in any case, I think that maybe if I could be the timekeeper too, we should move on to Brett Steele. Thank you.